Good evening, everyone. My name is Christy Dorr, and I am an associate professor of critical race, gender, and culture studies and literature at AU, as well as an anti-racist research and policy center affiliate. I would like to extend a warm welcome to our in-person and virtual audiences to race and reproduction in the post-Roe world, and to offer my gratitude to our esteemed panelists for their willingness to participate in this timely dialogue. And also allow me to express my gratitude to the ARPC's incredible team, including Leilani Love Harris, Kaylee Bryant Greenwald, Lily Wong, and Stevie Martin, as well as Sophia Dean, China Brody, and Sarah Kaplan for their intellectual and logistical support. It is truly exciting to be part of the center's mission of intersectional racial justice, research, and practice. I would also like to thank Lisa Barr of the Katzen Art Center for hosting us and our event co-sponsors, American University's Latinx Studies, Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, and the American Studies programs, as well as the Department of Critical Race, Gender, and Culture Studies. And I apologize, my glasses with the lighting have decided to darken, so I'm feeling my age. The idea for this panel came out of conversations that I had with ARPC Director Sarah Clark Kaplan concerning progressive accounts of and responses to the Dobbs decision issued in June of 2022. Recalling Angela Y. Davis's indictment of the abortion rights campaign nearly 50 years ago for its near exclusive focus on the interests of white middle-class women, we've been unsettled by the return to a discourse of diminished rights, opportunities, and safety dramatized in the popular media. Once again, the white sovereign subject is presumed to be Roe's imagined victim over the many whose access to privacy and bodily autonomy in the reproductive sphere has always been nominal and conditional. In response to this trend, tonight's conversation foregrounds the work of indigenous feminists, feminists of color, and their allies. Work which situates the politics of reproductive freedom within broader struggles against historical and contemporary modes of racial, sexual, and colonial regulation. We've invited this panel of experts to draw on their own work on race, indigeneity, sexuality, and reproduction to weigh in on our current post-Roe moment. To initiate the dialogue, we pose to them the following 4 open-ended questions. How does thinking through the frameworks of race and indigeneity shift how we understand histories of reproductive control in general and the historical significance of Roe in particular? How can we situate state prohibitions on abortion within broader relations of racial and sexual regulation and the reproduction of the hetero-nationalist settler racial state? What political possibilities for responding to this current moment emerge when we engage with feminists of color and indigenous feminist approaches to reproductive justice, reproductive sovereignty, and/or reproductive freedom? Conversely, how does engaging reproductive politics through the lenses of race and sexuality and through analyses of settler colonialism and racial capitalism help us work toward a politics of reproductive freedom grounded in the concerns, agendas, and futures of indigenous feminists and feminists of color? The agenda for our dialogue tonight is the following. Dr. Kaplan will make some welcoming remarks on behalf of the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center and introduce our panelists, each of whom will give comments for around 10 minutes. Following their remarks, Dr. Kaplan will moderate a discussion with the audience. So allow me to introduce Dr. Kaplan. Sarah Clark Kaplan is an associate professor in the departments of literature and critical race, gender, and culture studies, and is the executive director of American University's Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center. A scholar of women of color feminisms, sexuality studies, and Black literary and cultural production, She is also committed to activism and advocacy around issues of reproductive justice, prison abolition, and Black freedom. Her monograph, The Black Reproductive, Unfree Labor and Insurgent Motherhood, explores how the administration, expropriation, and imagination of Black reproductivity has been and remains central to U.S. racial capitalism. Sarah.
Thank you so much, Kirsty Dorr, for that introduction, and also thank you so much for the work that you have done bringing together this incredible group of speakers, thinkers, activists, for what I'm hoping is a generative and, well, probably a little enraging, but also hopefully a little bit exciting event tonight. So I want to start off just by letting you know a little bit about the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center, of which I am lucky enough to be the relatively new executive director. The Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center is an interdisciplinary hub for the research and practice of racial justice and intersectional liberation. We convene scholars, educators, community-based change makers, cultural workers, and policy advocates in sustainable and equitable collaborations. Together, we generate critical knowledge around race, power, and difference, and forge shared tools and resources for social change. As a center, we understand that while the problems of racial injustice, white supremacy, and settler colonialism may seem at times intractable and infinite, it is also necessary that we prioritize particular political struggles, points of intervention, moments of crisis, to act and to engage. At this moment, the center has identified a set of 9 critical points of intervention where we believe that the expertise of scholars at American University, the robust activist and community-based movements in DC and the surrounding areas have incredible strength and activity, and where we believe we are truly at crisis points where intervention is not only important, but essential. Here are the current points of intervention the center is focusing its work around: race and carcerality, reproductive justice, gender-based violence, migration, arts and racial justice, environmental racism and climate justice, anti-racist education, economic justice, and decoloniality and indigenous justice. Now, that said, at this particular moment this year, we've chosen to focus both our public programming and our scholarly and activist work around 2 key threads. First, 3 years after we all witnessed George Floyd's murder by police in Minneapolis, after a summer of cries to defund the police and an ostensible taking account by a number of governments and municipalities, we see that in fact policing is at a higher funding rate than it was even previously. We see that jails and prisons have only been shut down in order to build more and more, and a clear example of the many-headed hydra. And we see an increasing backlash against movements for decarceration and abolition. So this year we are focusing a chunk of our programming around the question of race, incarceration, and criminalization. Where are we and what next? Similarly, this year, and that was in fact going to be the singular theme, I will be transparent, for this year, and then the early version of the Dobbs decision leaked, and when crisis happens, we have to respond. This year, we are also centering our programming around questions of reproductive justice, race, and reproductive politics writ large. This is the first of a series of events that we will be holding over the course of this year, thinking about race and reproductive politics, both contemporary issues, but also the larger history of race, reproduction, indigeneity, settler colonialism, and the current stakes of decolonizing both bodies and the broader structures of power that reduce autonomy for all pregnant and childbearing people. We'll be doing this work both in our public programming and in both of these areas in what we call our research collaboratories. a set of working groups that we are convening around race and reproductive politics and abolition that will last from later this year through 2020, with spring of 2024. In fact, I'm thrilled to announce that tomorrow invitations are going out for the first of those working groups, the race and reproductive politics. And if by any chance you are interested in joining that working group and you're not already on our radar, which again, it's only my second year here, you might not be, please do email arpc@american.edu. It is a faculty working group. So for all of you amazing undergraduates and graduate students who are working in that area, we've been going back and forth about exploring something similar on the student level. And if you are interested, please also email arpc@american.edu, and our incredible campus outreach coordinator, Stephen Marvin, will reach out to you to think about what that would look like. So at this point, I'd like to take us through a brief introduction of our first panelist, and also to remind you that we will have 4 panelists speaking. At the end of those 4 panelists, we will be opening it up to Q&A. If you are one of the many, many people who are attending virtually rather than in present, please know that I will be monitoring the Q&A and will be asking your questions. Please do not post questions or comments in the chat. I know after 3 years of this, you know this, and I'm saying it anyway because somebody always forgets. Please do not post comments and questions in the chat. Please put them in the Q&A, and we will go back and forth between the audience who is in person and the audience on Zoom. And on that note, our first panelist today will be Professor Pat Zavea, Professor Emerita of Latin American and Latino Studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Dr. Zavea's talk is entitled "Reproductive Justice Advocates Contend with the Current Human Rights Crisis." Dr. Zavea completed her PhD in anthropology at the University of California, Berkeley. She publishes at the intersection of Chicanx, Latinx Studies, anthropology, and feminist studies on poverty, family, sexuality, health, work, transnational migration, and women's social activism. Her most recent work is "While You Are Struggling, You Are Healing: Latinas en Nat Poder Through the Movement for Reproductive Justice," in ethnographic refusals, Unruly Latinidades, edited by Alexis and Gina M. Perez. Her most recent book is "The Movement for Reproductive Justice: Empowering Women of Color Through Social Activism." And I have to say, on a side note, this is not part of the official bio, this book came out early mid-pandemic, and so it took me longer than it normally would have to discover it. But as a scholar of reproductive politics, I was so thrilled when I came across it and thought, where was this book when I was doing my copy edits? I would have totally tried to jam things in. So thank you very much. Professor Zavea is the recipient of the American Anthropological Association's Committee on Gender Equity in Anthropology Award in 2016, and the Association of Latina and Latino Anthropologists 2016 Distinguished Career Award, and Knox Scholar of the Year by the National Association for Chicana and Chicano Studies. She serves on the boards of 2 nonprofits devoted to reproductive justice. And now I will cede the podium to our first speaker, Professor Pat Zavea. Reproductive justice advocates contend with the current human rights crisis.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction and for the invitation. My book came out in May of 2020, and I wondered, was anybody reading it? But it's just a delight to be here with you. And I'm really excited about the conversation we're going to have. The frameworks of race and indigeneity are critical for understanding histories of reproductive control and the current crisis. Specifically, the frameworks of intersectionality and human rights used by the reproductive justice social movement enables us to see clear parallels between women of color, despite historically specific histories of racialized reproductive control. This view also illustrates how women of color are negotiating differences between racial categories and within them, and are working proactively during the current post-Roe crisis. I've been monitoring public statements, webinars, position papers, legislative efforts, and events, especially by women of color. As she mentioned, I serve on the boards of 2 reproductive justice organizations, and I'm on the listservs and follow social media of several others. So I get frequent updates on movement activities. Like others, women of color joined the widespread protests before and immediately after the recent Supreme Court ruling, expressing our outrage and fear of the consequences. National spokespeople, however, were strikingly silent about the effects of the Dobbs ruling on women of color. In my book on the movement for reproductive justice, I deployed the concept reproductive governance, initially formulated in the context of repressive reproductive rights in Latin America, to critique how various actors such as state institutions, churches, or donor agencies use legislative controls, economic inducements, moral injunctions, direct coercion, and ethical incitements to produce, monitor, and control women's reproductive behaviors and practices in the United States. Reproductive governance goes back to the founding of this nation with the control of women's reproduction during slavery, in which abortion prevention meant more property for white slave owners. Since then, we've had a long, complicated history of Christian nationalists sort of worried about the unconstrained fertility of immigrants and promoted the reproduction by whites. Anti-abortion politics really are rooted in the 1971 Green v. Connolly Supreme Court decision that withdrew tax-exempt status to racially segregated schools. And since then, white nationalists have targeted the Supreme Court going back to the 1970s and are now finding some strength in their desire to ban abortion altogether. Today, over 100 days after the Dobbs decision, 66 clinics across 15 states have stopped offering abortion care. I argue in the current post-Roe crisis with state impediments to accessing abortion services is based on implicit eugenics thinking by proponents of reproductive governance, since those impediments disproportionately affect poor women of color. Reproductive justice activists believe we should see the Dobbs ruling in a broad historical context in which anti-abortion politics are rooted in white supremacy. They insist that the denial of abortion services are symptoms of structural inequalities and discursive violences that must be remedied. So besides access to childcare with dignity, they advocate for living wages, immigration reform, affordable housing and childcare, paid family leave, environmental justice, etc. That is full human rights, as well as positive representations about people of color. The reproductive justice social movement engages in grassroots organizing and coalition building, policy advocacy at the local, state, and federal levels, and strengths-based and empowerment discourses about women of color. The mission of the reproductive justice movement is to advocate for people's human right to bear children or terminate pregnancies free from stigma, abuse, or obstacles, to raise children in healthy environments, and to bodily autonomy that includes the choice of gender identity. They explicitly counter the fundamental tenet of eugenics, the notion of racial purity, and advocate for racialized women and organize the most vulnerable, including the undocumented, LGBTQ folks, youth, the disabled, and those living in rural areas. They have responded to the Dobbs decision with 4 sets of strategies. First, activists believe we should focus on those disproportionately affected. Those who get abortions are usually low income and predominantly people of color. Among those aged 15 to 44, there were 23.8 abortions per 1,000 Black women, which is twice that of Latinx's and more than 3 times that of whites. The recent increase in abortions is related to the decrease in access to contraception perpetrated by the Trump administration's restricted funding of women's reproductive health. There was an 8% increase in abortions from 2017 through 2020 that coincides with the Trump administration's gag rule that disallowed counseling about or referrals for abortion, defunded Title X, and supported abstinence-only sex education. Trump's racist xenophobic discourse scared many immigrants from accessing any health care as well as social services. The Turner study that documented the effects of women being denied abortions and bringing pregnancies to term found that after 5 years, women had higher unemployment rates than those who had abortions, and they and their children experienced more poverty. They suffered worse long-term physical and mental health and had limited ability to pursue goals such as getting an educational degree, finding a romantic partner, or having more children. Being denied an abortion and forced to carry a pregnancy to term can be a death sentence, particularly for Blacks and Native Americans who experience disproportionately high maternal mortality rates because healthcare systems that service Black and Native American pregnant people are discriminatory and insensitive and under-resourced. These people often reside in states that did not expand Medicaid after passage of the Affordable Care Act, which denies coverage soon after the birth of a child when children may still be at risk for serious health problems. Blacks are 3 times more likely to die because of pregnancy-related conditions. However, those rates depend on where they live. In Los Angeles, they are 5 times more, while in New York City, 12 times more, while Native Americans are 4 times more likely to experience maternal death in Seattle. Legal scholar Michelle Goodwin points out that in the United States, a woman is 14 times more likely to die in pregnancy or childbirth than during an abortion. Clearly, targeted regulation of abortion provider law are not about protecting women's health, but controlling women's behavior. Further, it is often impossible to even obtain an abortion on some Native American reservations, where more than half of American Indian and Alaska Native people access healthcare because of the colonial legacy of a 1996 memo by Indian Health Services that stipulated women had to report rape or incest within 60 days to access federal funds. Abigail Echohawk points out that in the past 20 years in Seattle, for example, there were fewer than 10 abortions because of these restrictions. All of this was before the fall of Roe. Reproductive justice advocates have noticed that public outrage often does not highlight these consequences. So they are calling attention to the stories of those who have survived structural violences and those who have not. In light of the implicit racial underpinnings of anti-abortion policies, many activists seem to focus on pro-choice when it ignores the experiences of people of color as problematic, since it silences the links of the anti-abortion movement to white supremacy, the structural causes of increased demand for abortions, and the detrimental effects on pregnant people of color. Secondly, activists have long been preparing for this restriction on abortion services. In 2016, the Center for Reproductive Rights and Justice at the University of California, Berkeley, organized online events about self-managed abortions so that providers and supporters would be prepared. Medication abortion now accounts for 54% of abortions in the United States. However, increasingly, they are criminalized even in states where they are not legal, illegal. Native American activists have long referred women to abortion doulas and healthcare providers off the reservation. Repro Action has ongoing confrontations with corporations that suppress information about accessing abortion through social media. In California, Planned Parenthood began preparing for the fall of Roe and increase in out-of-state patients in August of 2021. These activists see their work in the post-Roe era as continuing what they have been doing. Third, there are ongoing stereotypes that women of color do not support abortion. You may have seen stories in the Washington Post and the New York Times focusing on Black religious leaders worrying about abortions. Actually, women of color repeatedly express their support for abortion access at rates higher than those of white women, and their support has increased over time. 82% of Black people support Roe v. Wade, and 85% of Asian Pacific Islanders support abortion access. 82% of Latinx support the government maintaining abortion rights. Activists insist we dispel stereotypes that people of color are anti-abortion and highlight all the stories of people's struggles for their rights. Fourth, drawing inspiration from immigrant rights and Black Lives Matter activism, coalitions in Austin, Chicago, California, Oregon, and more have announced they are sanctuaries for those seeking abortions. Professional associations have passed resolutions that view providing abortions as contributing to anti-racism and dismantling of white supremacy as part of reproductive justice. Over 600 healthcare practitioners and activists requested that the media stop writing stories that give equal space to anti-abortion extremists. Proposition 1 that would amend the California Constitution to prohibit the state from denying or interfering with individuals' reproductive freedom is on the November ballot and favored to pass. California recently passed the Reproductive Health Equity Act that codifies people's fundamental right to make reproductive health care decisions free from government interference and offers a year's supply of birth control and contraceptive counseling funded through state Medicaid, even to the undocumented. In the post-Roe era, as the demand for abortions as well as tubal ligations and mastectomies has increased in many states, many activists are offering information about local restrictions and how to access reproductive health services and support through webinars, in-person events, and on social media. So as to counter misinformation campaigns targeting Latinxes in Spanish, activists prepared informational leaflets for distribution at clinics and community centers. Fact Check Yabo, a Spanish language fact-checking service that focuses on the United States, launched to counter dangerous claims circulating on social media about abortion. I'll conclude following the lead of Marcella Howe, Executive Director of In Our Own Voice. In a recent webinar, she argued the current human rights crisis is not only based in the Dobbs ruling and states' limitation on abortion services, but also with voter suppression that often occurs precisely in those states where abortion services are most limited. We all know it will take major political interventions to counter reproductive governance, so the struggles are ongoing. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Zendaya. Our next speaker is Dr. Elizabeth Rule, Assistant Professor in Critical Race, Gender, and Culture Studies at American University. Elizabeth Rule, an enrolled citizen of the Chickasaw Nation, is an Assistant Professor of Critical Race, Gender, and Culture Studies. Her critical Indigenous studies research has been featured in Washington Post, Matter of Fact with Soledad O'Brien, The Atlantic, Newsy, and NPR. She has also released articles in American Quarterly and the American Indian Culture and Research Journal, and has 2 forthcoming monographs. The first, Indigenous DC, Native Peoples and the Nation's Capital, forthcoming from Georgetown University Press, analyzes historical and contemporary sites of Indigenous importance in Washington, D.C. Dr. Rule's second book project, Reproducing Resistance, Gendered Violence and Indigenous Nationhood, links reproductive justice and the missing and murdered Indigenous women. Rule is the founder of the Guide to Indigenous Lands Project and creator of the Guide to Indigenous DC 2019, Guide to Indigenous Baltimore 2021, and Guide to Indigenous Maryland 2022, digital maps and mobile apps. They're very cool. You can download them. They're fascinating. Rule's work has received support from the Henry Luce Foundation, MIT Solve, Mellon Foundation, Ford Foundation, Center for Black, Brown, and Queer Studies, and more. In 2021, she was recognized as an AT&T Women's History Month honoree and was named among the National Center for American Indian Enterprise Development's 40 Under 40 and received the Library Company of Philadelphia's Innovation Award. So now presenting from that amazing second book project, Dr. Elizabeth Rule, From Sovereignty to Sterilization, Reproductive Justice for Native Women.
Great. Are folks able to hear me in the back? Excellent. Thank you for that very kind introduction. And thank you to our moderator as well as our organizer and all of the faculty and staff who made this event possible, as well as, of course, all of you who came out this evening to learn about and engage in a dialogue about a very essential subject that affects everyone. As was said, my name is Dr. Elizabeth Rule. I'm an assistant professor here at American University, and I'm researching and writing about the intersection of reproductive justice and gender-based violence in one of my forthcoming texts. And today I'm going to be linking a couple of those essential notions through a conversation about sovereignty and sterilization and how both of those play into this essential question around reproductive justice within Indigenous communities. So before I get going, I do want to issue just a brief content warning that I'll be discussing sexual assault, sterilization, violence against women, domestic violence, and homicide, which are all forces that, yes, are connected to reproductive justice. I want to start off by thinking through the history of forced and coerced sterilization of Native women as a precursor for thinking about the moment we're in today. So throughout the 1960s and 70s, the Indian Health Service, which is the primary healthcare provider for Native peoples in this country, carried out forced and coerced sterilizations of Native American women in an act of federally backed violence. These sterilizations occurred at such high rates and under such deplorable conditions that many Native feminists summarily condemned the practice as an act of genocide. Quote, "They took our past with a sword and our land with a pen," one Cheyenne tribal member charged. Quote, "Now they're trying to take our future with a scalpel." The U.S. Government Accounting Office's April 30th, 1975 investigation into the quote, "permanent sterilization of Indians at Indian Health Service facilities and contract facilities," end quote, does not actually acknowledge the occurrence of forced sterilizations, but it does recognize breaches in securing informed consent. So I will leave that to you to figure out. The report, which was released on November 6, 1976, showed that a total of 3,406 sterilizations took place at the Indian Health Service facilities in Aberdeen, Albuquerque, Oklahoma City, and Phoenix, all between the years of 1973 and 1976. So again, that's approximately 3 years, more than 3,000 sterilizations, approximately 1,000 sterilizations per year, which comes out to around 3 per day. But some claim that even these numbers are low. Dr. Connie Pickerton-Urey, for instance, found that IHS, or Indian Health Service, sterilized at least 25% of Native American women, ages 15 to 44, throughout the 1970s. Marie Sanchez, a Cheyenne tribal judge, discovered that 30 of the women she interviewed had been sterilized by IHS between 1973 and 1976, including 2 15-year-old girls who intended only to receive appendectomies. And, we know that this practice, right, is not only limited to Indigenous communities, but also affected Black and other brown communities as well. So Northern Cheyenne tribal member Mary Ann Bear comes out, conducted a survey on Northern Cheyenne territory, revealing that 56 of the 165 women aged 30 to 44 had been sterilized over the course of 3 years. And she aptly concluded that at this rate of sterilization, the birth rate amongst this group would be reduced by more than half over a 5-year period. Andrea Carmen, the executive director of the International Indian Treaty Council and Yaqui Nation activist, represents the views of many that such sterilizations constitute, quote, "a concerted attack on American Indian women," end quote, which amounts to genocide. The reason behind such targeted and systemic sterilization efforts is simple. quote, as long as indigenous women continue to reproduce, there will continue to be indigenous people. And indigenous people are directly connected to lands and to Aboriginal rights, end quote. Cherry Chichu of Cree Long Lake number 58 First Nation elaborates upon this point by noting the esoteric connection between indigenous women and land and the ways in which infringement upon reproductive rights and abilities inhibits indigenous peoples' abilities to disrupt attempts at colonization and land theft. So again, obviously, this is a clear reproductive justice issue that I want us to keep in mind as we think about reproductive justice concerns in the present moment. I also want to introduce the larger scope of gender-based violence through a brief discussion of the missing and murdered Indigenous women, which I imagine some of you have heard of, perhaps more likely have heard of than the sterilization statistics I just reported. So what does this have to do with reproductive justice, right? Well, in my forthcoming book, one of the things that I'm really arguing and advancing is the idea that we need a full scope of gender-based violence in order to understand the true root causes of the disproportionate rates of homicide affecting Native American women. And I put forth the idea that reproductive justice is an essential but understudied component of that gender-based violence, right? And so just to give you some brief insight into those disproportionate rates of violence, the US Department of Justice has found that Native women are murdered at 10 times the rate of the national average. This leads homicide to be the third leading cause of death for Native girls and women ages 10 to 24, and the fifth leading cause of death for Native women ages 25 to 34, according to the CDC. Relatedly, the National Institute of Justice has found that 84% of Native women experience violence of some form in their lifetimes. And in total, we have 5,712 at least missing and murdered Indigenous women in the US today, according to the National Crime Information Center's report in 2016. Now, we can see a clear data gap between this well over 5,000 figure and the 116 cases of MMIW that are actually logged in the DOJ's database for national missing and unidentified persons. This represents a very serious data gap, and again, gives you just one brief insight into the questions that remain about why this violence is happening, how it's unfolding. And of course, until we get a better understanding of those root causes, we won't be able to actually move toward a solution or preventative measures, right? So again, I'm thinking about this, right, as a pressing issue of which reproductive justice plays a clear role. Now, in the post-Roe moment, an interesting question has emerged about abortion services on reservation lands. And just to be clear about who we're talking about, when we think about this assertion that tribal lands need to be opened up to become new providers of abortion, right? I first want us to be clear that there are 574 tribal nations across the United States here today, now in 2021, that's a contemporary number, 574. And these tribal nations are able to exercise their own jurisdiction over tribal lands when they hold those lands. So again, we have this sort of assertion, right? This immediate kickback about tribes becoming basically abortion havens. But I'd like to share the quote by Rachel Lorenzo, who's Laguna Pueblo and Mescalero Apache, and the founder of Indigenous Women Rising, which is a reproductive justice organization. She says, we see rhetoric on social media or in the news like Roe v. Wade being overturned is the end, the sky is falling, she says. But the sky has been falling for Native people specifically. We've been living in the apocalypse without full bodily autonomy. And so this brings into the conversation something called the Hyde Amendment, right? Which prevents the use of federal funding for abortion services. And this is directly connected to tribal status because treaty rights include the right to health care so often, right? But that health care, again, comes out of treaties that are carried out through the federal tribal trust relationship and are made available again through facilities like Indian Health Service or their urban equivalents, right? Let's all keep in mind that Indian Health Service is also the same body that was carrying out those forced and coerced sterilizations. So because of this example of federal legislation, there is not only a logistical barrier to tribal nations becoming abortion havens, but also, again, this sort of blind so often in women's and feminist movements that preclude, again, what Lorenzo calls an apocalypse, right? And that apocalypse I would characterize as being colonization writ large. So just on a concluding note, I would encourage us to think about this quote by LaDonna Bravewell Allard of Standing Rock Sioux. She says, "The abuse of women is well known in history, and it tells you a lot about what's happening to our earth," right? So as a concluding note, and again, with a focus on colonization, when we adopt that framework, right, of settler colonialism, it makes us clearly see how things like the contemporary issues around Roe v. Wade are serious, right? They have material consequences, but also the ways in which conversations coming from within feminist and women's rights circles can continue to preclude specifically indigenous women, right? And we see that particularly come to light when we consider the full range of violence through missing and murdered indigenous women, and also through the historical context of forced and coerced sterilization. Violence on Native women's bodies is thought of oftentimes as being analogous to violence on our land, and we remain, right, colonized. And so this is clearly an important concept to keep in mind when we think about reproductive justice and making sure that our efforts are truly inclusive. So with that, I'll say Chotashki. Thank you.
That was amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Rule. Our third speaker, got so excited I left my notes at the table. Our third speaker tonight is going to be Dr. LaMonda Horton-Stallings, who is on one of my papers. That's fine. Here we go. Dr. LaMonda Horton-Stallings, Chair and Professor of African American Studies at Georgetown University. Dr. Horton-Stallings is the author, as L.H. Stallings, the author of The Afterlives of Kathleen Collins, a Black woman filmmaker's search for new life, from Indiana University Press in 2020, A Dirty Self Manifesto, Sexual Resistance and Imagination in the New South from University of California Press, Funk the Erotic, Trans Aesthetics and Black Sexual Cultures from University of Illinois Press 2015. Mother is Half a Word, Intersections of Folklore, Vernacular, Myth, and Queerness in Black Female Culture from Ohio State University Press in 2007. And today, Dr. Horton-Stallings will be speaking on lessons from Black sexuality studies, region, religion, and rights. Thank you, Dr. Horton-Stallings, and I'm going to back to
Thank you for inviting me. And I'm gonna try to mash up some stuff, and so bear with me. I'm gonna start off with reading a portion from A Dirty South Manifesto and go into a different conversation that this chapter in A Dirty South Manifesto made me think about with regards to the Dobbs decision. And so I'll start with this quote from the Fierce Center's billboard. Black women take care of themselves, take care of their families by taking care of themselves, abortion and self-care. And then another quote from Stacey Abrams, Georgia happens to be uniquely positioned at the nexus between the attack on abortion rights and the economic impact of the entertainment industry. But we have to understand that these bills are part of the strategic efforts to overturn the rights of women for the entire country. And so, the dominant narrative about how women can lose or win reproductive rights and freedom so often compressed to one facet of abortion is one in which they must rely upon judicial systems, specifically the Supreme Court. However, in the decades since Roe v. Wade provided late 20th century gains, reproductive freedoms, cultural apparatuses have diminished those gains in the 21st century. Culture remains important because it provides the forms, aesthetics, and narratives shaping popular debates and legal arguments. When birth control and abortion were legalized, the most significant influences were quotidian narratives seen as the depoliticized and private, in addition to scientific and medical concerns. As the 21st century has revealed, these latter narratives were always political and certainly cultural. They simply have been produced by society that culturally values science, empiricism, and rationality. Even as we exist in a society focused on technological innovation and supremacy as a way to maintain empire, such innovation has not precluded a devaluation and purposely misinformed usage of science and empiricism to uphold religious beliefs and doctrines that detrimentally impact women's lives. The basic premise of any family planning, individually, communally, or societally, is never really just a concern of health and assurance that people who are not white or economically privileged will have some semblance of reproductive justice and reproductive freedom, entails a change of culture around sexuality as opposed to sexual health. The health of cisgender women, transgender people, and gender non-conforming persons, as insurance companies, pharmaceutical research trials, laws, and government policies have historically shown, is not a priority for this country, because their lives are not a priority. Southern states make up a segment of the country where there is little compromise or no sexual education. This region is a place where various forms of birth control, including Plan B and abortion, are still not widely accessible due in large part to religious objections. In addition, as in much of the United States, its poor are criminalized for their eating habits, sexuality, and attempts to access a better quality of life. Therefore, when any organization or popular culture platform centered on this geographical region chooses to address abortion or the abortion debate as about something more than medical care, it means to change the culture and mind of the region. The struggles faced by such groups reflect how and why state policies create and continue conditions for gender, sexual, and class oppression, while also limiting options to overcome such oppression. Historically, reproductive justice and freedom movements by people of color and white supremacist patriarchal societies have radically imagined the abolition of forced, coerced, and involuntary motherhood away from US Eurocentric family planning models of empire and colonization by decentering white, adult, able-bodied cis women. The tone and confrontational approaches of the Real Afia Center billboard and the epigraphic kind of conversation that Stacey Abrams initiates are long overdue. They highlight the limitations of older modes of civil disobedience and the necessity of creating alternative tactics for gender and sexuality and sexual resistance in the New South. Afia's deliberate choice, the Afia Center's deliberate choice to use the term self-care as opposed to the religious organization's use of healthcare in this debate is a bold move to redirect the conversation away from the medicalization rhetoric strategically used by pro-trust advocates in medical communities, as well as away from the morally authorized personhood language used by religious pro-lifers. A recent CDC data exposed the maternal mortality rate of Black women is more than 3 times higher than that of white women in the US. The cultural billboard exchange, however, is part of a decades-long debate over efforts to detrimentally impact women in the South. And so, for me, in terms of what Black Sexuality Studies has or can say about this, I turn to a couple of things. First, the question that was posed to us: how does thinking through the frameworks of race and indigeneity shift how we understand history of reproductive control in general and the historical significance and role in particular? I've had to ponder this question each time I have moved from university to university, teaching about race, gender, and sexuality in Black Sexuality Studies classes. In my current class, I introduce students to social and political constructions of race and sexuality, while also charting how Black representations and constructions of genders and sexuality and popular culture of Black people in the US, Canada, South Africa, and Caribbean have addressed the sexualized violence, medical exploitation, and apartheid, and sexual colonization and Eurocentric ideas of sexuality and eroticism rooted in racism, capitalism, and erotophobia. It is very different than the classes I taught early on in my career on gender, race, sexuality, and class, when I was teaching at a Big Ten university or junior faculty teaching at 2 Southern universities, in which I would teach about abortion, but I would not have the time left to do the kind of work on sexual violence, sexual colonization, erotophobia that I have in the whole class on Black sexuality. So before we even get to abortion debates, that this re-education around colonization and sexuality has to happen. In my current university, a Catholic Jesuit university, I also asked this question when I thought about how I might be positioned teaching about sexuality and reproductive control at a university that consistently discusses race, slavery, and reconciliation in myopic terms, never connecting it to questions of sexual abuse, the church, and its mission. A place that never understands how a terrorist mixed race pathing for white golden child Patrick Healy, first and only Black president of Georgetown, had a mother who was owned by his white father. Why histories of reproductive control matter when positioned from frameworks of race and indigeneity matter for reconciliation projects at Georgetown and other universities. What is reconciliation and repair for following the condition of the mother, as slave children always were? A slave mother, a father who owns his child, and a biracial child passing to become president of a Jesuit university. Both the ways in which reproductive control is thwarted and appeased matter before and after the child is born. In Black life, they cannot be divorced from each other. Currently, I keep thinking about reparations, reconciliation, and reproductive justice. That this is an important thread to ask for this as repair and reparative process of giving Black women, and thus all women, something beyond monetary funds or land that addresses the sexual terror and violence that Black women have historically, presently endured in the US empire. Abortion is self-care, but abortion is also about reconciliation and repair. Teaching on abortion from a Black Studies foundation has allowed me to present ideas of self-determination and the impacts of slavery, colonialism, and empire, and that with regards to women and how they get to control their body, but also controlling the spiritual consciousness that informs any Black woman's construction of self-determination. Loretta Ross's insistence on thinking about reproductive justice does brilliant work to address surveillance, policing, and containment carried out via state institutions, public health, and state violence in regards to sterilization and abortion and other reproductive justice issues. So in ways that reproductive rights and social justice confront legal systems regulating family planning and voluntary motherhood, the conversion around spiritual warfare, moral development, and the irresolution of a mind-body split from a spiritual assimilation conversion that turns to the medical abortion is healthcare facts rhetoric is a problem. It's a problem, as we've already heard, because of the Hyde Amendment, because of medical school curriculum. Abortion is also a form of resistance to colonial spiritual systems that teach about the body and mind split. It's important to think about these kinds of conversations in regards to reparations, repair, and reconciliation, and to hold universities and churches accountable in this conversation in the same ways that we do courts. Thank you.
Thank you, LaMonda. So we're taking a second of tech here because, well, this discussion is giving me life. My computer is a little less convinced. It would like to be something. Need the extender part. Sorry, y'all. Okay, so while the tech team does their amazing work, I'm going to introduce our final panelist who's going to come up here. Did I not bring this up? We introduce our final panelist, Professor Alexis Lothian, Associate Professor. That's what's wrong. Of the Harriet Tubman Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at the University of Maryland, College Park. Dr. Lothian is Associate Professor in the Harriet Tubman Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, where she is also core faculty in the Design, Cultures, and Creativity Honors Program, and an affiliate of American Studies and Maryland Institute for Technology and the Humanities. Her book, Old Futures, Speculative Fiction and Queer Possibility, was published by NYU Press in 2018. Her scholarship has appeared in American Quarterly, Feminist Studies, International Journal of Cultural Studies, Cinema Journal, and Camera Obscura, among other venues. She is currently working on 2 book projects, one on the politics of fantasy and /fan fiction, and one on the emergence of social justice discourse in online fan culture. And I'm going to do a little tricky thing here. I'm very tricky. Here we go. Hold on. I have it. Is it on there still? Will you all tell me? It is, isn't it? I have it back now. I do. Okay. You're all very patient. Hold on a second. Going to move this to this screen and start the show. I would be fine with applause for that. That was. And with no further ado, Professor Alexis Lothian and Reimagining Reproductive Futurism.
Where do I press?
So let me show you. This.
Okay, great.
Make sure that's true.
Yes. All right, great.
Thank you. Thank you so much to Kirsty, to Sarah, and Lily for this invitation to present in this amazing company. I'm very honored to be here. To the staff for the labor of organizing, also to the ASL interpreters who are making this event accessible on Zoom. I think this is my first in-person panel since COVID, so I'm very, very happy to be here. So as a scholar of speculative fiction, and the relationship between futures that we imagine and futures that bodies are kind of considered to bear, my instinct on being invited to join this panel was to look for the imagined futures and otherwise worlds that are being invoked as the world comes to terms with the consequences of the Dobbs decision. So I'm going to look at one way the post-Roe v. Wade reproductive politics take their cue from white feminist dystopia, and then turn to how Black feminist speculative fiction enables it. So the overturning of Roe v. Wade is the end of the world, according to mainstream, predominantly white US feminist movements that come under the framework of reproductive rights. Fighting for the rights ostensibly maintained by the 1973 Supreme Court decision has, after all, provided the framework for decades of self-described pro-choice activism. After so many calls to march, donate, and vote lest we lose Roe v. Wade, when Roe v. Wade is lost, it inspires apocalyptic levels of despair. It feels like dystopia. And the intensity of that feeling overwhelmed public discourse, hiding the ongoing work of reproductive justice movements, for whom Roe's end is just one more defeat to keep fighting against. The dystopian rhetorics that show up in feminist activism are shaped by speculative fiction's long history of reproductive dystopias, in which state control over pregnancy, birth, and childbearing are explored. In my book, Old Futures, I track some of that history back to the early 20th century. I name a dystopian impulse in which fiction, theory, and politics can engage. A negative speculation that asserts the future, as it's possible for us to know it, can be destroyed. Dystopian impulse is exemplified by George Orwell's words in the classic white male dystopia 1984. If you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot destroying a human face forever. If we think about who might be called upon to imagine that versus who lives with the generational consequences of having survived it, the limitations of this understanding of dystopia become clear. The dystopian impulse has often been a colonial one, in which violence, long rendered routine for Black and Indigenous people, gets projected onto the bodies of white Americans and Europeans. The warning is that we must not let this happen, without recognition of the myriad ways in which it has happened before and is happening now. The equivalent of the book destroying the human face in feminist fiction and politics is the reduction of women's bodies to their reproductive function. Oh no. Something happened, I clicked something, help.
Oh, no, no, you're good, you're okay.
Okay, just focus on the thing. I promise. Did it work?
No. Usually if you put the mouse on the, okay, no, it should work. No, that's there. It should work. Yeah, okay. So the most famous, infamous, white feminist dystopia is Margaret Atwood's 1985, The Handmaid's Tale, adapted for Hulu in 2017, still currently airing. In this narrative, the falling fertility rate gives a pretext for Christian fascist takeover in the US, and bodies with uteruses that can create a healthy fetus are adopted as a national resource. As handmaids, fertile women are systematically raped by men who hold power while their wives are gone. The TV version provided a vivid set of images to renew the novel's currency, featuring handmaids and signature red dresses and marketing itself as the worst-case scenario for contemporary politics, complete with slogans that would look at home at a protest outside Planned Parenthood. Book and film alike set their dystopia within the structure of reproductive futurism, a term first coined in 2004 by Lee Edelman and developed and critiqued by many queer studies scholars, including me, since then. Reprofuturism describes a political framework that invokes children and the future at every turn, usually at the cost of marginalized adults in the present. It's every political act that invokes a smiling family to verify the legitimacy of a candidate. It usually calls upon white children and is more successfully employed by the right, but it shows up in numerous political formations. So-called pro-life activism, with its weaponization of smiling babies on billboards and pamphlets, is a species of reproductive futurism, demanding that every unborn child be placed ahead of the adult person whose uterus might house it. The Handmaid's Tale makes that valuation literal, erasing every aspect of personhood for potential gestations. No wonder then that its iconography has proven so useful to activists who are trying to resist what they see as a reproductive rights apocalypse. Two among very many images that have gone viral on social media, we see white appearing women dressed in red, billboards saying, Supreme Court protect us, save Roe now, this is not fiction. First potential, then real, the overturning of Roe v. Wade gets claimed as the moment that brings Atwood's narrative of rape, forced birth, and ruptured kinship from imagination into reality. As I'm very far from the first to say, the problem with this use of Atwood is precisely that the violence she describes is not fiction and that it was. Every injustice suffered by the handmaids and other women in Atwood's imagined future, and many more, as the scholars all on this panel have discussed, has been or is being experienced by women of color in the US and elsewhere. To frame the handmaids as dire messengers from a future yet to come is to dramatize the erasures of reproductive rights movement as such as whiteness.
as this panel was convened to highlight, the glaring problem with the apocalyptic framework of feminist reproductive politics after Roe v. Wade is that what it meant to have the right to abortion was never clear or equal. The idea that constitutional protection for abortion makes the matter of when and whether to bear children into some kind of rational independent choice requires ignorance or refusal of the interplay between race, economics, disability, and reproduction in the history of the US and elsewhere. We can recognize the very real impacts of the change in law without the exceptionalizing narrative that implies getting Roe v. Wade back would actually provide reproductive justice. The organizers of the 2021 Women's March in DC banned protesters from wearing handmaids costumes for precisely this reason, stating that this imagery erases the fact that Black women, undocumented women, incarcerated, poor, and disabled women have always had their reproductive freedom controlled in this country. This is not a dystopian path for the future. A group coordinating DC handmade protests argued back that the costume's visual power and iconography made them worth it, because the imagery inspired professional and amateur photographers to expand the reach of our actions around the globe. The catchiness of the dystopian iconography, of course, like the calls for the Supreme Court to save us, or the language of choice of the only framework within which we can think about reproductive freedom, is precisely the problem. So what's the alternative? I got the white word off the speak. So I find myself drawn to the handmade protesters despite their problematic slogans and racial illiteracies because of the way they pull an imagined future into the present. What might become imaginable if this nexus of possibility were to be merged with feminist of color and indigenous feminist approaches to reproductive justice, sovereignty, and freedom? So these are actually characters in The Handmaid's Tale. I didn't plan to make this talk about The Handmaid's Tale. I started watching the latest season just to kind of see what it was going to be like and to kind of hate watch it. And I now think I might have to write something about these characters at some point in the future, because it's bad, but it's on race, but it's doing something interesting, and I don't quite know how to think about it. In these margins of white feminist popular culture, connections emerge to the understandings of reproduction and dystopia that women of color feminist speculative fictions have long created. So somehow The Handmaid's Tale got into my talk, which was supposed to be about this book. Now it's just coming up at the end, because I wanted to talk about the book or the framework that I wish could be the speculative fiction guiding the activist movements in response to the end of Roe v. Wade. And there are many things that could be, but I am particularly fascinated by the enormously successful Black feminist fantasy author, A.K. Jemisin, the trilogy of Broken Earth. It's about social, political, and geological cataclysm, refusing the framework of dystopia because, as she says in a recent interview, dystopia makes no sense when you're talking about people for whom the society they live in is dystopia. It's possible to draw numerous allegories to contemporary politics and movements in her work, but it never constitutes a warning against how bad things could be, because things are already known to be that bad, of course. Jemisin reimagines reproductive futurism in ways that portray both liberation and autonomy, consent, and choice for people who can give birth sometimes happen, but never get taken for granted. Pregnancies run the gamut, We have forced impregnation, conditions of enslavement, birth and childbearing and joyful liberation, infanticide by a parent freeing a child from a fate worse than death, calculated baby making to invest in hope for the future of a community, and abortion engaged matter-of-factly because a pregnant body has other things they need to do. The story's arc centers reproductive justice, with a Black mother protagonist turning the world upside down to make her children's lives possible. So they're out of time. Of when I was writing as well. And so I want to say that there are a lot of speculative connections to be made, or ways of using kind of speculative imagined ideas of otherwise life that maybe we can have in our conversation that connect some of the things I've heard on the panel today as well. But I wanted to finish with Jefferson's opening line, which seems a good place to consider starting and confronting how speculative imagination could work for reproductive justice in a non-dystopian post-Roe world. Let's start with the end of the world, why don't we? Get it over with and move on to more interesting things.
What a exciting panel. And I'm actually gonna leave, if it's okay with you, Alexis, that, oh, did I do something? No, yes, I did something. There we go. Let's leave that last slide up because I do think that is an excellent framing for a lot of what our panelists have been talking about, the sort of limits of this apocalyptic framing. So I'm going to open it to Q&A. If it's, I'll start with anybody, a question in the room. If anyone in the room has a question, while I do the work. Yes, let me do this.
Lily, do you mind being our microphone?
So my question regards digital activism, specifically because it's so impactful in reaching younger generations. But it's also this very quick and to the point thing. Do you think that digital activism is in some way flattening this discussion to simply questions of whiteness, as opposed to encapsulating the full discussion of the way that reproductive justice has encompassed women of color and people of color in general for such a long time? Do you think digital activism has narrowed it in a certain sense by flattening the topic because we just want to get the clicks?
I'll say, I do know, like, there's been some digital hashtags that Black reproductive justice people have done that I think have been effective. So I'll just say I'm not sure if it's hindered anything in that sense. I think it just has to be you're in the right kind of circles. But I do think people like why did the name just go out my head? People like Moya Bailey and some other people have talked about this in very specific regards to race. So I do think even with this what we're talking about post-Dobbs, like that there's still that potential. It just has to be in the right hands. So sorry.
You're great on that. So these mics are currently not working. They're actually apparently props. They were working before the show, but now they are entirely ornamental. They are 4 ornamental mics.
I'll try.
I don't think you have any expertise either. He's not here, is he? Did we unplug something to plug me in?
No. Don't try to blame it on me.
Okay, well, yeah, did anyone else have an answer to that question? Digital activism? I'm looking at you, Elizabeth, you don't have to answer. I just feel like,
You're such a digital pro.
Sure. I highly recommend following Elizabeth on social media. It's a delightful rabbit hole.
Thank you. I mean, I think social media is interesting because I think it can become different things to different people, right? And so we're all familiar with the idea that it can become an echo chamber, right? And so I think like so many things, you know, we have our own responsibilities, right? When we're thinking about reproductive justice or any other issue, right? And have a responsibility to intentionally exit the echo chamber feature of social media. That said, I mean, something like the missing and murdered Indigenous women's issue, right? Which you know, I'm sure that there are multiple folks in the room who are familiar with this, was not something that was, you know, a household awareness. I'm still not sure if it's reached the level of being household awareness, but not even university campus level awareness, right? Not folks who are interested in progressive politics, right? It was very sort of niche, and we need to remember that, you know, violence against Native peoples and Native women in particular has been ongoing since colonization, right? And so the fact that we have visibility for the last 5 years around this issue is great, and it's wonderful, and it's largely due in part to social media and specifically the use of hashtags like hashtag MMIW. But again, you know, in context, you know, that's against hundreds of years of it being an invisible, you know, or not widely discussed issue outside of very sort of specifically Native communities. And so that's a perfect example of the utility. And so I think it's like anything, right? We can use it for good or to limit things. So, you know, yeah.
Thank you. Other questions? Okay, I'm gonna yes, do you mind? Yes.
Okay, so I think that in terms of movements and I guess specifically here, the issue of, you know, the erasure of women of color in this reproductive movement, reproductive justice, there's often, I guess, an issue of not just, you know, the side of people who are not necessarily knowledgeable, maybe ignorance and sometimes lack of sympathy, but I think that there's also you know, the problem of people who have sympathy, but not necessarily the willingness to take action. And I guess there's people that you can't necessarily convert into doing something about this. So I was kind of wondering what your take on kind of pushing forward that specific group of people, not necessarily who are knowledgeable, who have the capacity to be sympathetic for, you know, women of color and, you know, people of color who are being left out of this movement. But what would you say would be some of the best ways to kind of be a catalyst for change for those people who have the capacity to do so, and, you know, kind of ensuring that there's no wasted potential?
I'd like to take that first.
I'll take a stab at it. That's a really great question, and it reminds me of the reproductive justice activists who work precisely with women who have that potential, but who do not see themselves as activists and certainly haven't been involved in much activism at all, perhaps around immigrant rights. But for many of them, getting involved in the movement is a process of consciousness raising, and the movement very directly trains around things like know your rights or abortion access or any number of issues. Abortion is just one little piece of that. And what I've observed is once women who I went to an event in South Texas. There were 20 women in a leadership conference, and most of them said they had never been to a demonstration. They didn't quite know how to do that. And so one of the little tasks was, how do you pull off a demonstration? You know, and those of us who go to college, we were like, it happens all the time. You know, you don't really think about how to do it. But it turns out they told them there are 10 rules to organize a demonstration, one of which is the person leading the chant. And by the end of this training, these women were like, okay, I've never been to a demonstration. So now I sort of like it. And now what could I do with that knowledge? And that happened over and over again around different issues. So I feel like there's so much potential out there. And the one thing the Roe crisis has done is it has made us all see how it's not just a few people who are denied access to human rights, it's everybody is. So now what does that mean? So I think we're in a moment of really rethinking a lot of the divisions that we've been living in, and a potential for somehow moving toward a different kind of politics. So I remain optimistic, actually, as many of these activists do.
Anyone else want to take that stab on that one?
I'll just say, to me also, just in terms of thinking about this, more everyday ordinary stuff, to your point, I think about this question of like the Black church, and I think about what you just asked, and people who might not go out and protest or do any of those things. But given everything in the South, maybe they'll drive somebody somewhere or something. And those are important kind of things to, you know, for people who are in the church and are having this conversation and don't see them doing that other stuff that might could see them doing stuff like that. To me, that's important in the South. And I think having those kinds of everyday little things matters in the same way these other kind of acts can. So
Yeah, I can follow on to that, because it makes me think actually about the contrast between the kind of imaginations of the two texts that I was talking about, where Handmaid's Tale is like, if you didn't get out in the street early enough, you cause all these problems by your inaction, and you know we should have been doing more. But which, I mean, there may be certainly there are aspects of truth to that, people should be out in the streets, but there are other ways also to participate in making the world less unjust. And one of the things that I find really compelling about N.K. Jemison's work, or like the idea of world building, is that it's not something you do kind of by going out there and like putting yourself into the political realm, the making a world that works differently and operates differently from the oppressive world that you've received is something that you can do in your own community in multiple contexts, whether that be like a church or a classroom or a family, you know, or online for that matter. And that doesn't just mean spreading a hashtag, but it might be like being in direct communication with somebody and either sharing knowledge or like helping someone see the world a slightly different way. So I think the idea of world building as opposed to kind of activism is something that I find helpful in just thinking about what is changing, right?
You know, just to add to that, I think, you know, Alexis, one of the things that we've been talking a lot about at the center, and you know, I talk a lot about in my own sort of activist circles other than the centers, how important it is for us to imagine that we're constantly doing the work of practicing the world that we're trying to produce, right? That there is both the kind of world building in the way that N.K. Jemisin does it, the sort of the work of imagination that we see in the literary or cultural text, but there's also, I think, something that feminists of color in particular have taught us for years, that the work of imagination also happens in the quotidian practices, right? It happens in how we engage in creative world building in our interactions with each other and our ways of operating together. And I think that is where we do imagine a kind of, we do imagine a kind of alternative, a world that is a free world, right? I mean, I always think of that moment, you know, and there are many ways we could talk about that, you know, led from that opening to this bridge called My Back, that Sherry Moraga intro, right? I mean, there's many things we could say, and some parts of it have stood the time better than others, but one of the reasons I still always teach it is that scene, you know, where she and Barbara Smith, she's staying at Barbara Smith's house and she's sleeping on the couch, right? And Barbara comes and they hug each other and they're thinking about how the work that it has taken to build that relationship, it's an actual labor, right? There's real world building that goes into imagining, you know, feminist of color solidarities, right? And I think that is, I think, part of what goes beyond even empathy, right, is a move or trying to, or even information, right? It's not just a technocratic work of creating knowledge or sharing information. It's not just the work of like making people care or even teaching them what to do. It's actually engaging in the work of imagination with practice of of solidarity in a broader way, the practice of building coalition and alliance, which does, among other things, require recognizing that for many of us, this has always been happening, right? This is nothing new. We had another question.
In terms of like social media activism, that makes me think about algorithms and the way algorithms are racially biased and have pushed white feminism to the forefront, especially on TikTok. But like what I've seen a lot of times is a co-option of certain imagery, and particularly like co-option of like pride. And like I saw when this decision happened, like people were co-opting the red hair print, which is notable for missing murdered Indigenous women. And so maybe I'm a bit more pessimistic about this, and I'm just wondering if there is a way for like our imagery and imagery that promotes this intersectional way of fighting, like if we can prevent it from being co-opted. Is there a certain strategy we can do, or are we doomed to be co-opted by essentially all these white middle-class women who don't view our bodies as our own?
That is a really good question. Go for it, Pat. I see you're gonna take the lead on that really big, hard question.
It's a really big, hard question. It's also a bit puzzling, frankly, because you know, my limited use of social media, I'll be confessional and say, you know, it's really about Facebook. And you know, my friends joke that, you know, Facebook is for old people, but you know, I own that. But what I experienced about social media on Facebook is this beautiful world of friends who are predominantly, for lack of a better word, woke, people of color, people who are critical of what's going on. And so postings that are generative, postings that show this is how awful it is in the world, and this is what people are doing, and this is what I'm teaching, what I'm reading, what I'm thinking about. And so in many ways, it's the complete opposite of what you're talking about. And so I want to be on that world, and, you know, I get on Facebook as often as I can. And I always joke that it's like going to work, you know, it's like hanging out with your friends, like, you know, here's all this great stuff going on. And that's a different experience. So for me, it's all about where do you find social media that feeds you as opposed to offends you. And I know from working with reproductive justice organizations, all of whom use social media, there's this wealth of material that's coming out. So I really feel like there's a way in which you can, you know, look at some of the bad stuff and say, you know, this is really screwed up. But try to find those sites and those politics that make you feel like, okay, I'm seen, I'm heard, there's a community out there for me. I want to do what they're doing. Elizabeth, and then Alexis.
Yeah, sure. You know, I think as you were talking, what really came up for me is the critical understanding that I think all of, you know, my co-panelists also brought up as well, which is that, you know, the conversation is about Roe v. Wade, but it's also much larger than that, right? It is about something like reproductive justice, and reproductive justice does not exist in a vacuum, separate and apart from racism, right? Or separate and apart from any of these other sort of systemic issues, right? And so when you're talking about something like social media, right? Or the racism behind algorithms, which is totally real, and I encourage everyone to look into that. Or the co-opting of symbols, right? And symbolism, you know, all of these things are bad, right? And they are destructive. And I do think that they can generate serious, you know, material harm in some cases. But I think that there are also single manifestations, right? Of a much sort of larger systemic colonial violence, right? Those are iterations of that, the same way that, you know, the Dobbs decision is one sort of iteration and blip, right, in a much larger, longer issue around reproductive justice and how reproductive justice, like even in my own work, I was talking about, can't be part of a different conversation than something like missing and murdered Indigenous women. So, you know, that's not to say that we shouldn't focus and think about those things, but I think it's useful when we think about, you know, is there hope, right? When we see these things happening, about looking at all the bad things that we see happening and understanding, again, you know, do we see an intervention and a possibility for things like solidarity, hope, resistance, to systemic issues at large? And I would say yes, that's why I do the work that I do. I think that there are those possibilities, and I think that part of the precise violence of those systemic issues, like colonization, right, like settler colonialism, is that it takes different shape, right? And so now that we're in the era of social media, we see social media emerging as this sort of battleground where, you know, all it takes is the ability to tweet something out or make a TikTok, and you know, you can infringe upon, right, these otherwise you know, useful efforts and movements and so on. And so you know, I think that that's a useful way that I think about it, is that, you know, social media is a new ground, right, through which these ongoing issues are now being played out. But I think that when we look and take that sort of long view, right, it helps us both understand the extent of the issue, but also maintain a possibility for where we can go next in terms of resisting that violence. That's how I think about it.
All right, that, I really appreciate that the social media as the kind of space in which conflict plays out. What I wanted to say was thinking about the shape of that space and what structures it, because of the way that attention works in the social media economy, where the algorithm is racist, yes, and then also the racist thing gets uplifted and given more attention by everybody talking about how racist it is. And so that this sort of loop arises, and that's part of the structure of social media, and that's part because you can't like, you don't necessarily want to let something go off into the world and do harm without challenging it, but then challenging it was part of the harm by circulating it further. And I thought that the sort of the way that you have created your Facebook into this space of solidarity and coalition is kind of the flip side of that algorithm work, where we actually do use that loop to kind of make something else. Like I think I see a lot of turning inward in people that I know, like a lot of turning away from the more public aspects of social media as they become more toxic. That's a kind of world thing too, and some of it sort of is hard to argue with. So I was just going to say something about the kind of challenge of that ground, but I actually like what you said a lot better about thinking about like the longer struggle that's taking place, and understanding this is just one part of it. So
We're going to take one more question if we've got one in here. Q&A online is closed, is empty, not closed, it's open. It's open. But there are no open questions currently. We're good to, yes, please, Tracy.
Yeah, excellent panel. Thank you so much. Thinking about the way in which the dystopia and the overturning of Roe has allowed white women to recenter their critique of the patriarchy as sort of the center critique. And there's been so much work to forward issues of reproductive justice prior to those, and how to disrupt this recentering, which I think is what you're all trying to do, and I think we're all trying to struggle with, but I think we don't understand enough of white women's complicity, you know, as opposed to this assumption that they're sort of involuntarily participating in this. And I'm wondering how we call out more the complicity of white women in the recentering of their issues, and by using jobs to recenter their power.
Does anyone want to talk about, the active complicity of white women in their recentering post-jobs? Because I think it's very true. I mean, it's real, right?
I think there's maybe something about women of color, feminist voices and ideas having become a little more mainstream, like people know what intersectionality is, and then dog becomes an excuse for saying, oh well, but it's all about women as women, which means white women. Like that, almost like a relief among white feminists who have become accustomed to being called out and become defensive, and then suddenly get to assert themselves again. I mean, I completely agree about complicity, and just thinking about like the backlash, is it a backlash for me? And suddenly we find ourselves back in this kind of like a 1970s moment, which makes me also think about Turks and transfeminism and the kind of constant recurrence of like arguments that seem to have been put aside, but the constant need then also for feminists of color to put their energy into calling it out again, like iterating it again to explain once again why this thing that was critiqued and kind of, but when I teach sometimes a class called Feminist Conflict, and we read, feminist conflict and critique from the 70s and 80s, and it's often feels as if it was written yesterday. Students are really shocked to realize this conversation has still been going on. And in some ways it's really generative to realize, wow, this conversation has been going on for so long, but it's also like, and these white women just keep coming back with the same thing and thinking that it's new. So yeah, that's really answering why, like what to do about it, but just noticing on it.
I mean, I think also just in terms of still the kind of preservation of white heteronormative family, like this is part of why the complicity remains in terms of not understanding different configurations of family and how class and capitalism figures into that, not wanting to let go of capitalism and what it affords them. And so I think why abortion is easier or the issue is because then it doesn't have to take up these other issues where class intersects with the white heteronormative cis patriarchy. Sorry.
Get my mask off. I'm just going to add one more piece to it, and that is it's not just about white complicity, it's about women of color who are complicit with white heteronormative patriarchy as well. And so, one of the famous spokespeople is the head of Planned Parenthood, who never says women of color that I've ever seen. She doesn't. She at one point, I've seen her a lot of times in the post-ops, crisis. She will say race and class intersect in complicated ways, and I'm just like, could you please just say what's going on here? And so there's a way in which, it's somehow considered to be impolite to talk about race, and certainly to call out the complicity of white feminists. I mean, I think many of us have been there and done that and are really tired of it, but also like, where does that get us in this moment? I think many of us, certainly many women of color, reproductive justice activists will tell me privately, I can't tell you how sick I am of Planned Parenthood and their racial politics, and yet we have to work with them. And so what we'd really like to do is just do our thing and collaborate with them when we have to. That's a real hard political place to be. And this crisis really calls out how collaboration is something that we all have to do at this moment, and it's going to be really hard.
And I think I agree with all of this. And I think, Tracy, one other thing that occurs to me is I keep thinking kind of weirdly old school Wendy Brown, like, when she talks about like the turning to the man in the state, like old school Wendy Brown, like I keep thinking about how this also, because this came from school, right? Because it came from the Supreme Court, because it isn't the kind of quotidian, like bureaucratic neoliberal process through which pregnant people of color and non-pregnant people of color's bodily autonomy and reproductive capacities are constantly surveilled, policed, and criminalized. That the way this is very clearly like the state came down, they screwed it up for everybody, the state has to fix it, we need a law, that it's really allowed for this terrain that, you know, white cis women feel very comfortable on, this idea that now we know what we're doing, it's between us and the white man in the state. Like we turn to the man in the state, we tell the man in the state, Joe Biden, pass your law, Joe Biden, like engage in a new act of settler colonialism and force open, you know, indigenous territories, and like, you know, like it's all of this sort of narrative of like turning back to the state. So it's like white women and, you know, daddy in the state again, in this very comfortable kind of appeal for recognition that is a dynamic that is both very old, but is also very much about like kind of re-recognizing white women as both victims of the state and protected citizens of the state, right? It's this double whammy that is, I think, very attractive to a lot of white cis women activists. And I think particularly, I think, you know, going back to the sort of, it's the same way that the family then becomes like, men, you need to protest, you know, for the right to abortion for your women. And I'm like, there are no men in my house. Like my 5-year-old came, but you know, like, you know, there's like, so there's again, this kind of desire to turn back to these structures that both, you know, protect and victimize white cishet women as the sort of terrain of struggle. Because they feel comfortable, right? And because they recenter a particular kind of positionality that I think white women feel very comfortable in and seen by. So I don't know, I mean, I've been thinking a lot about this myself because it is so explicit, right? It's just so intense. So I think we will see anyone else on the panel. I shoved in my closing comments, even though I'm not on the panel. Does anyone else have a closing comment? A last thought you'd like to leave us with? No? Thank you. Thank you all so much. Thanks for this panel. If you missed a part of this or want to chew over a brilliant part of it again, please, we will be, I believe, pre-recorded it. And that it will be, as always, cleaned up and posted on our website. So thank you all so much.